Welcome to another podcast from MindSureHealthcast.com. As you may or may not recall, if you watched the last time, we started a two-part series. I think we'll keep it at 2 parts. I mean, it could be 10 parts, but if we really went into it in detail, but as you well know, everybody would become bored. Nobody would follow through that many broadcasts, and it would be a waste of my breath and the video space on YouTube to do that. So we want to keep these as concise as possible, but yet at the same time to give you enough information to challenge, provoke you, prove me wrong, whatever, to get you to start looking on your own. We have a serious problem in our world today. If we look at the United States, we see that chronic illnesses are out of hand. We see that the cost of the so-called health care, which I call sick care, is out of hand. We see that people are getting worse all the time, and yet we boast to have the best health care system in the world. Well, you know that's garbage, because the results do not prove the hypothesis that we have good health. We don't, and it's going downhill worse. When I was young, I never saw a young child or infant with cancer, and I didn't see people having their gallbladders taken out at 13 and 14. I didn't see heart attacks in the teens. I didn't see strokes in the 20s. And I certainly didn't see a lot of the other things that are going on today. I didn't see everybody standing in line or sitting in waiting rooms that were piled up with people waiting to get in to see the doctor because there were so many sick people with so many problems. And I certainly didn't see the health bill any outlandish amount as far as the gross national product. It was almost negligible. So something bad has happened, and it's almost as though, as I've mentioned so many times, that we see this big wizard up on the wall, which is really a virtual image, it isn't real, being manipulated by the real wizard behind the curtain, who is pulling all the pulls and pushing all the buttons and clicking all the switches to make all this look like something great going on, while at the same time nothing is happening. And that's kind of where our healthcare has gotten to. So the reason that I chose to spend all this time and all this digging and research and reading through thousands and thousands of pages and watching videos and listening to CDs, etc., is to bring this information to you in somewhat of a provocative way to wake you out of your trance. Now, of course, that's part of the problem, is that people are in a trance. So anyhow, this particular subject that we had picked up on was modern psychiatry, and we called it Shameless Manipulation of the Modern Mind-Brain. And basically, that's what we have. There are people who have written in the psychological field about people being in trances and waking up from trances, and so basically it seems to me that's kind of where we are. So in this session we're going to wrap it up as much as we can, because as I say, if I were to give you lots of illustrative cases, I could go on for hours really and only scratch the surface. So I have to pick some high points that are provocative enough to get you to want to look into it. Now, I mentioned that a lot of what I've had to say is covered in this book called The Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, and it's subtitled Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America. It's a very good book, well researched, and covers a lot of the psychiatrists that I know that have become dissenters because of what has happened with psychiatry. And it is really, we've created, as usual, more diagnoses issues. In other words, we've created all these little boxes that we can give names to and a diagnostic and statistical manual numbers to, so we can turn it in for insurance coverage. And that's the way you develop an industry for yourself. If you've got a way that you can create your own need and then offer a fulfillment of that need that's extremely profitable to you, it works out extremely well. And of all the professions, I hate to say, I think psychiatric has been one of the worst. I had studied in the field of psychiatry many years ago. I told you before, I took a program at Cleveland Psychiatric Institute, basically under the auspices of Case Western University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. It was a 2-year program, and I got exposed in Cleveland Psychiatric Institute to what was called the schizophrenic community, so I know a lot about it, and I spent a lot of time in there working with people who, quote, were supposedly schizophrenic. This book, I think, was extremely well done, and it's not the only book. I mentioned Peter Bregan, who is also a psychiatrist, graduate of Harvard, taught at Harvard, and has been in the field for years and years, called Toxic Psychiatry, and several other books that he wrote. And the other one that I had mentioned of his was called Your Drug May Be Your Problem, and in this case he's talking about psychiatric drugs. All of the, I'm saying this so I don't forget to say it, all of the alternatives that have developed over the years, either in or out of this country, have been ignored, poo-pooed, or deliberately suppressed, because ultimately, out of the whole picture, an industry was created that was both highly profitable for the doctor of psychiatry and the pharmaceutical companies making those drugs that are prescribed. We, I guess, have this cognitive dissonance problem of seeing something but not seeing it, or if somebody brings to your attention something that's contradictory to what you normally have believed in and followed, that somehow you, if the person is credible, you put the information in one side of your mind somewhere, and then you have the other information in the other side of your mind that you believe, and the two never get together. So you say, oh yeah, well gee, that doesn't sound good at all. And then it goes, put away. But tomorrow I've got to go see my doctor because I need another prescription, and it just doesn't connect. I mean, it's almost as though the two halves of the brain are not interconnected as they normally would be. And so we just continue to go on and on and on. And every time we're showing a carrot on a string, on a stick, out there, that, well, what we're researching now shows some good promise in this field, and all we need is a little more time and a lot more money to research it. And boy, you go out there and you put on these marches and you bring in all this money, and boy, we're going to come up with this magic pill yet, or this magic injection or magic procedure, whatever it is. But almost always it's going to be a pill or injection, because it's going to be backed by the pharmaceuticals. And as I've mentioned before, all research anymore is pretty well backed by money, which means, and profit. So therefore, the only thing that gets researched is something that has a possibility of producing a lot of profit once it's done. Otherwise, it's not, because people are concerned with the real problems in general. Now, I'm not saying there are not some people, but in general, the big money that goes into research is profit-driven, and therefore they're anticipating that out of that research, they're going to get information that they can use to market a product and make a lot of money. So you can anticipate that kind of research, if you're a researcher, I think you're going to have a slight bias toward producing something that is helpful to market the product that the company is putting up or developing, that they're putting the money up for you to research about. And so, you know, if they put in millions of dollars and you did all this research and you can go back and say that the drug, the product, whatever it is it's worthless. In fact, it's dangerous. Do you think that you're going to get any more money from those people to do any more research? Probably not. But if you come up with something that says, well, yeah, in many cases it's helpful, and in enough cases that it's kind of over the edge, it's a couple of percentage points above placebo, so therefore it's just probably a good marketable product. So then they are going to go out and market, going to make a lot of money, and guess who they're going to come back to for the next product that they want to put out? They're going to come to the person who's going to produce the research. Now, am I saying that every researcher is dishonest? No. Am I saying there are some that are viable? Yes. And I don't even have time to get into that side of it. You know, after having studied for the last 200 years of medicine and pharmacology and diet and health and soil and food and processing and manipulation and engineering of the genes of food, and I'm just on and on and on, I think I've developed probably a good view of the reality of things, not the way I would like them to be, but the reality. I would like it to be that all researchers had high-level integrity, that companies who had a proposed product, when it was proven not to be good, were willing to take the hit and go on to something else. I would like to think that's the way it is, but in the real world, it's not like that. It's profit-driven, and the integrity can become compromised. And we've brought up some cases before, how that when a doctor goes against the grain, so to speak, how they're rapidly destroyed. All these inferences are let out to the press, and all of these stories are started, and all these people suddenly show up and come forward and say, yeah, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, and I know that he's not on the up and up, and he may not even have any background for what he's talking about, I mean, and just go on. And they have a way of diluting and discrediting anyone who runs counter to the grain, so to speak. So now, I mentioned last time that in this whole field, psychiatry actually wasn't doing so well. You know, they didn't want psychologists, and they wanted absolute control. I mentioned before, they didn't want dentists, they didn't want podiatrists, they didn't want psychologists, they didn't want any of these, quote, subfields that would in any way interfere or take away from the money and clientele that they wanted. They wanted absolute control of the field. And each of these specialties or subgroups that came along, they had a hard time to ever get a license. And I experienced some of that in the natural field, and I've watched the manipulation in the background. And I've seen the dirty tricks and the various schemes that have been developed to try to somehow interfere with any competition. So it's nothing new to me. I know the average person does not want to believe that. I know they don't want to believe that anybody that's in a power position would deliberately do things that were underhanded or discreditable and so forth. They don't want to believe that. And they want to believe that everybody is looking out for their benefit. Pharmaceuticals are in business to help people. People in the medical profession are all there to help, and I believe a lot of them are. But I also believe that the ones who are really there to help people and attempt to do so, in many cases, lose their license. And I could name you a long list of doctors, because they were getting people well, not because they weren't, but because they were getting people well, and it was not using the standard approach. Those people ended up losing their license, or even worse, have gone to prison. So I know how it works. And I know you don't want to believe that, but I think if you went out and really started digging, it wouldn't take you long to come up with the other side of the story and find out that everybody who runs counter to the current thought is not bad or wrong. I mean, look at Albert Einstein. You know, when he first developed the concept of relativity, the physicist, the sanctioned physicists said, that's a crazy idea, and they laughed about it. And it went on for some time until finally when people got to reading it seriously, they all of a sudden one day said, wow, this guy said something profound. And all of a sudden the snickering and laughing stopped. But it wasn't because of the physicists, it was because of the acceptance of others other than the entrenched leaders that really did the turnaround for it. And then pretty soon everybody said, well, yeah, of course, everybody can see that that's true. And they all jumped into the parade at that point, and none of them were willing to say, yeah, we thought he was crazy and stupid. They wouldn't be willing to admit that now. Of course, yeah, it makes sense. And so we see the same thing happening all the time. Now, as I said, psychiatry was not doing real well. I remember when Freud helped take people out of the dungeons that they were chained in cellars and dungeons and treated like animals until they died, and say, well, it's not that they have brain fever, but they've got some unconscious issues going on, and with the right type of approach, we should be able to improve that. And so he started a whole new trend in psychiatry. But psychiatry, of course, like any other field of medicine, science, or whatever, is pretty inflexible. And once they do grasp onto something, they're not very willing to alter, adapt, modify, improve, expand. They get into a niche and they like to stay there. So anyhow, as it ended up, Freud had a lot of good material, but it wasn't a total answer. In fact, in many cases was not an answer at all. And so what did we see that happened in psychiatry? They went back a bit to the barbaric side. Psychosurgery, a la the cutting of the brain frontal lobes in one way or another, or damaging them, so that you could control somebody's behavior. Now, of course, the one flew over the cuckoo nest was good, a very good example. If the person's causing too much trouble, the simplest thing to do is to shut them up one way or the other. And so, as I mentioned at one point, one of the psychiatrists said in a lecture I was attending that tranquilizers were medications given to patients or to help the psychiatrist's anxiety. And so in this case, the same thing was true. If you can't get the person to be as calm as you'd like them to be and as trouble-free as you'd like them to be, well, then the thing to do is to shut them up one way or another. And so lobotomies were one, whether they went in and chopped up the prefrontal lobes of the brain, either from going through the temples or putting a couple of boreholes through the front of the skull and going in and literally putting scalpel in and slicing up the frontal lobes of the brain. Or the transorbital lobotomy, where they took what is like an ice pick, pulled the eyelid out, put it above the eyeball, punched it through the bone around the eye socket, which is pretty thin, and went in and just worked it back and forth till they chopped up the front on each side. And basically all the person had was a couple of black eyes. But they were pretty calm after that when the frontal lobes weren't working anymore. And so that was one of the big treatments. The other, of course, was the electroconvulsive, where they put the electrodes on and shoot a powerful current through, and they fry the frontal lobes so that they don't work. And, of course, the third biggie was insulin shock therapy, where they would give the patient a massive dose of insulin that would run the blood sugar down so low they would go into shock. And if they didn't die, sometimes they got quiet after that. I'm not sure if it was because it did anything for the brain or it scared them so bad that they learned to control their behavior better, which may have been one of the forms of behavior modification. Who knows? But anyhow, the psychiatry wasn't doing so well, and what talk therapy they were doing was so divided among so many different schools of thought that their record wasn't great. And it was right at the beginning of the first psychotropic drugs that I got involved with learning about psychiatry on an intense level. And so they came out with some of the early, very early drugs. The narcoleptics, which were antipsychotic drugs, and the tranquilizers. The benzodiazepines were the first group of things that they put out. And of course, they assured everyone that the benzodiazepines, Valium type drugs, were not habit forming, no problem, and they hooked millions of people on those type of drugs, and still do. And the other one, of course, did a job on the brain and the body, the Thorazine and the other neuroleptics that they had out. And so as time went on, they started experimenting into other forms of drugs, and so we had things like the tricyclic antidepressants, and a lot of other things came out to try to manage brain function. Now, the public was led to believe at some point that the brain was actually malfunctioning and needed these drugs to correct biochemical disturbances. That was the story. And pretty much still is the story, but in fact it's not true. The drugs do affect the brain, but what they do, they shut down things in the brain or overstimulate things in the brain. Things like the antidepressants, they're going to stimulate and raise the activity by overstimulating either serotonin or dopamine or both. And the others are going to calm down by over-influencing the GABA circuits of the brain. And so those are the two big opposing things. But in the meantime, they've come up with a lot of combinations, and you name it. And if you take this one, that one doesn't help, then take this drug on top of it, and that'll probably knock you out good. But what they're not telling, of course, is that instead of actually taking care of deficiencies in the brain, they're actually damaging the brain anywhere from minor to major. And there's huge amounts of evidence, and if you read the adverse effects of any of the psychotropic drugs, you don't have to take my word for it, just go into the PDR and read each of these drugs and look under all the problems and indications of things they need to watch for and adverse effects, etc., and you'll see that they're not improving brain chemistry in any way, that they are actually damaging the brain and potentially permanent. Now, I read to you last time about this young lady who started in early teens on drugs, psychiatric drugs, not recreational drugs, and that before it was done, she was totally disabled, permanently disabled. And I told you a friend of mine left the pharmacy business. He had a doctor of pharmacy and wholesale business selling to hospitals and drugstores. And at some point, he was involved in some research, and that's what opened his eyes. And when he saw a 21-year-old young man, perfectly healthy, being reduced to a helpless cripple permanently, even when he warned the psychiatrist that it was going to happen if he didn't take him off the drug, the psychiatrist said, absolutely not taking him off, and so the guy was permanently disabled with tardive dyskinesia, and you'll see that shows up a lot. And recently I saw one advertised on TV where they didn't call it tardive dyskinesia. They said if you notice that you're losing, having lost control of your muscle movement, which is tardive dyskinesia, that's when you can't control your muscles. They have all kinds of jerks and jumps and so forth, and permanent damage. And so the psychoactive drugs are very harmful. And so psychiatrists like Peter Breggin and several others were looking for and developed other ways to help people and became big spokespeople against those. Now, the interesting thing about it is, and I have to say this to the defense of new people coming into the field, I'm not excusing them, and at some point there is no excuse once they're in the field of psychiatry. But here's what Whitaker says about the rise of an ideology. He said it was not surprising that medical students accepted the dogma of biomedical reductionism in psychiatry uncritically. They had no time to read and analyze the original literature. What took me a while to understand as I moved through my residency was that psychiatrists rarely do the critical reading either. In other words, once they get into the field, they still aren't going back and looking at what I'm doing really good, or what is the study? What are the real studies about it? Now, this comment I just read you and is quoted in this book was from Colin Ross, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Southwest Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. And he said this back some time ago. And so what happened is, you have these new doctors coming in, and they, like you and everybody else, thinks medicine is always doing what's best for people because they're in the field to help people. And so these young psychiatrists developing, they take it at face value, it must be true, or they wouldn't be teaching it. And so they don't have time to go back and research years and years of studies and literature to find out about all this stuff. And once they get into practice, they're so busy seeing several people an hour, contrary to the old psychiatrists, that they're not going to take the time to have to go back and research. And besides that, what they're doing is sanctioned by the profession, so therefore, why would they want to rock the boat if they're pulling in a good salary? Remember, I quoted a psychiatrist, a young psychiatrist, saying he got $750 for a small amount of time with some of his colleagues discussing, and he thought, wow, there's a lot of money to be made in this profession. And so here's what the writer of this book also had to say. He said, "We have investigated the epidemic of mental illness that has erupted in the United States during the past 50 years in a step-by-step fashion, and having reviewed the outcomes literature." Now that's where you get the information. Okay, here you did this study, and did the people get well, and did they remain well? What happened after they started being treated with some of these drugs? For each of the major disorders, which is an obvious next question to address. Why does our society believe that a psychopharmacological revolution has taken place during the past 50 years when the scientific literature so clearly shows that the revolution failed to materialize? Or to put it another way, what is the source of our remarkable societal delusion? And he says to answer that, we need to trace the rise of biological psychiatry and then look at the stories that psychiatry, once it embraced that belief system, came to tell. Now, of course, as I said, they keep telling you that, oh, these are tremendous, we're getting tremendous results with these drugs, and this one doctor wrote a book called Listening to Prozac. Everybody almost sounded like in his book should be on Prozac because of all the great benefits for it. I read about a study when chronic fatigue syndrome finally became recognized as a problem, and so the medical profession and the pharmaceuticals jumped on the bandwagon what they were going to do, and of course they couldn't do anything. But then I heard there was one study going on in Europe by a major pharmaceutical for people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And I thought, well, gee, I wonder what it is that they've come up with. Number one is why there is the problem, and number two, how they would go about treating it with drugs. So when I got a hold of the study was actually Prozac, and the big antidepressant. And so people who, of course, with chronic fatigue seem to be pretty depressed. And so I guess the theory is, well, we can't really help the problem, but we can give you a mood brightener, which is basically what and this type of antidepressant is referred to is a mood brightener. So what we do is give you this mood brightener so you'll feel a little better mentally, and you won't care that you're sick and nobody can find out what's causing it or get you well. And so that was the study. It apparently didn't pan out as well, although I think that's what they still do about it. And so this whole thing, psychiatry was in a mess, and as I said, actually fewer people were going into the field, and the people in it were thinking, uh-oh, our profession is going to die if we don't do something. So they started this trend on the drugs. Once they found that they could manipulate mental states by shutting down and or disturbing parts of the brain, they could improve temporarily behavior. But in some people it didn't work. Not only did it not work, but they received further damage and went further downhill. And many committed suicide. As the psychiatrist I studied was said, you'd never give a badly depressed person an antidepressant because they may be contemplating suicide but don't have the energy to do it while they're so depressed. And he'd seen many cases where once you gave an antidepressant, they just went out and committed suicide. And generally, the true suicides don't say in advance, well, I think I'm going to kill myself, or I feel like I'd like to kill myself. They just do it. They plan it and they do it. And you don't know it until after the fact. So, what happened is the psychiatric profession, after the first few psychoactive drugs, decided, wow, that's what we need to do. We need to move in that direction. So they changed their diagnostic and statistical manual, which, as I said, when I started, was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Emotional and Mental Disorders, number 2. While I was in the program, they came out with the revised number 3, which removed emotional mental disorders, and also they added started the move to make every psychological problem a biochemical problem of the brain. And then they inferred to people that taking these drugs would correct the imbalance, which was not even the problem. In fact, as you will see if you read through this and Bregan's material and a lot of other psychiatrists, you would find out that they actually cause all kinds of damage and problems. Some reversible, some not reversible. But yet we keep getting sucked into it. Instead of teaching people how to cope in the world, which I was when I was studying, happy with the Masters of Social Work, MSWs, because they were extremely good at crisis intervention and getting people to make improvement without pumping a bunch of drugs. Now, I don't know, today they're probably doing that because I said the clinical psychologists have a move going on now that they can be allowed to use psychotropic drugs too, because they realize if they have somebody and they send them to a psychiatrist for a psychotropic drug, they never come back, and so they've lost their patient. And so they want to be able to do that same prescribing themselves. And I guess, I don't know how much they know about the real story of psychotropic drugs, but evidently either they don't know or they don't care, which is not a good sign. So, by changing the diagnosis and eventually to the DSM number 4, I mean, everything is pharmacological, and psychotherapy is a thing of the past in terms of the psychiatric profession. They can get you in and out in a few minutes, either renewing your prescription or giving you a new one or adding 2. You're out the door, and instead of seeing 1 an hour, they can now see 4 to 6 at an hour, and it can work out very, very well because they're getting pretty much the same fee for the short visit as they were getting for the long visit before, and it took a lot on their part to engage in the psychotherapy for that hour-long period, or actually they used to call it the 50-minute hour. For that 50 minutes, how long it would take and how much effort they would have to put into it, as opposed to saying, here, take this, get it filled, and if that doesn't help, come back and see me next time. Or more often they're going to schedule you, say you come back and then we'll review and see how you're doing as to whether the medication is doing okay or we might have to add more, change, or whatever. And so, bit by bit, this is what ended up as the field of psychiatry. And anybody who tries to interfere with that is going to find what it's like to have the wrath of the medical establishment come down on you. And Bregan happened to have been one of those. He had unfortunately tried to warn other psychiatrists and the public, and wrote some books, and he pretty fast found out what happens when you go against the grain. Now, again, this is from this book, The Anatomy of an Epidemic. There's, as I say, there's a pile of books. I'm just giving you one that seemed to sum the whole thing up. As we have seen, American psychiatry has told the public a false story over the past 30 years, and when you read the book, you'll see what I was talking about and some of the things I've brought up. The field promoted the idea that its drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and when they do, no such thing, and it grossly exaggerated the merits of the second-generation psychotropics. In order to keep the tale of scientific progress afloat, now see, they're telling people, well, we're continually improving, we're finding better things, it's going better and better. Don't worry, if it's not doing as well today, we've got new things coming up, and there's not going to be any problem. In order to keep the tale of scientific progress afloat and to protect our own belief in that tale, it has needed to squelch talk about the harm that the drugs can cause. Now, as I mentioned, there was another guy, and another doctor, I don't know if I brought that up last time, I don't know that I did. He developed an approach to schizophrenia that worked equal to or better than drug therapy with no drugs, and much, much less cost. And it's a model that I knew that was going on in Belgium many years ago, actually, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And this guy was doing his work in the, if I recall, the 90s. And what he had is that he had these houses where the schizophrenic people would go and stay, and they were run by unprofessional people, but who were trained enough to be able to sit and give these people some type of communication and encouragement and interaction and so forth. And his therapy was getting the people well and getting them back functioning. But he didn't have to use the drugs. So that didn't set well because they didn't like this movement. And his name was Lauren R. Mosher, and he called his therapy Soteria, S-O-T-E-R-I-A. And I was just looking at one of the research papers about it. And anyhow, a review of it showed that it was doing extremely well. So it wasn't that it wasn't working, and it wasn't that it was costing a lot of money. In fact, it was costing a lot less money, but it did not use psychotropic drugs, which is where the big money was, and so they drummed him to the point and misrepresented what his findings were, drummed him out of the National Institute of Mental Health, and so he resigned from the whole thing. He resigned in disgust. He says, I want no part of it anymore. And so he was one of the casualties. Dr. Bregan, he was a big one for a while, or at least they tried to. They were not successful with him because what happened is, on one occasion, this was way back in 1987, and he was up there. He had graduated from Harvard. He had been on the National Institute of, or National, Association of Mental Health, and etc. Anyhow, Bregan appeared in 1987 on the Oprah Winfrey television show where he spoke about tardive dyskinesia, which we mentioned just a little while ago, and how that dysfunction was evidence that neuroleptics damaged the brain. Okay, his comments so infuriated the American Psychiatric Association that it sent a transcript of the show to NAMI, which in turn filed a complaint with the Maryland State Commission on Medical Discipline, asking that it take away Bregan's medical license on the grounds that his statements had caused schizophrenia patients to stop taking their medications and thus created harm. And so that's what they tried to do. And as it ended up, of course he prevailed because he's still around, but it was a big fight and of course a lot of money. And so that particular approach has gone on, and just in the last 3 years I know of a psychiatrist who quit psychiatry, turned in his license, because now there's a new thing where people are monitored, doctors are monitored as to whether they're writing a lot of prescriptions or not, with all the computers and the pharmacies and so forth. They can monitor it. And so if you are a doctor of medicine or a doctor of osteopathy, it's happening also, that are supposed to be prescribing all these drugs and you're not doing it, guess what they do? The board notifies you that you're not writing any or enough prescriptions, and hence if you're not going to be writing prescriptions, you don't need your medical license. In other words, saying if you don't write more prescriptions, you're going to lose your license. And so this one psychiatrist that I know about, he never had gone into the psychotropic drugs, and he was using nutrition and other natural methods like psychotherapy to help people get well. And when they got on his back and said, we're going to take your license if you don't start prescribing the drugs, he said, you can have the license, I quit. And he did. He quit practicing. So there are people of integrity. And so when I'm saying what I'm saying, I'm not saying that there's not doctors out there either that are ignorant of the problem and are so busy they have never taken the time to find out what it really is, or that there are doctors that once they do find out what's going on and they see what it's doing to people and they can't do it anymore, they've got a big problem. And there are doctors of integrity, and I don't ever want to leave the impression with you that I'm saying all and every. I'm always saying many, because there are some that go into the medical profession as a business, not as a healing art. It's a business where they're hoping they can make a lot of money and get a lot of prestige and whatever it is that they're going to get out of it. And their motivation is not that of helping people, so they're willing to buy into whatever the field presents to them. Here's the standard way to do it. Well, then fine, that's what I'll do. And if the person gets sick, harmed, or dies, well, that's collateral damage, and we can't help that. But we're going to help a lot of people, so it's just the case that some people, unfortunately, have to be casualties so that others can benefit. So they can rationalize in their mind about it and go on and do it. But as I say, there's some doctors who absolutely say, no, I can't do it anymore. I'm either going to do it the right way or I'm out of the field, and many times they don't get that chance because they swoop on them like a big pack of vultures or buzzards and pick their carcass dry before they get a chance to do anything except be pushed out of the profession, or in many cases, as I say, I've known that they go to prison. And I think I mentioned a long time ago, there was a doctor in California, and it didn't have to do with psychiatry, but it had to do with cancer, which is the other sacred cow of medicine. And so he realized that the standard approach of chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery wasn't cutting it, and people really weren't getting well. And he had a PhD in biochemistry as well as a medical degree from Harvard. And so he started utilizing his knowledge of biochemistry and came up with other approaches to help people get better, which he was doing. He so infuriated the medical establishment that they not only ended up taking his license, but they wrote a letter to Harvard and wanted Harvard to withdraw or take back his medical degree. They wanted to squash him good. And so there's a certain vindictiveness in those people who don't like to be crossed. This is the way we have said it's supposed to be, and if you don't buy that and you cross it, you can expect some big trouble out of it. And so I leave it in your hands. I can't make people think any certain way, and I'm not really trying to make them think. I'm trying to open their thinking so they can reach their own conclusions. I mean, if you research back over the years, as this man is talking about, I would get his book first because he's got some pointers as to where to go to find out what we're talking about. And if after doing all your research you feel it's for you, then fine, that's what you should do. I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I'm only wanting to say that if you're going to do it, make sure it's an informed decision, not that you're following the crowd. And if you follow a herd of sheep and the front sheep goes over the side of the mountain, you don't want to follow over just because that's where all the other sheep are going. I'd like to think that you would want to take some concern for your own welfare based on your own thinking and not because everyone else is doing it. I'm sure the people and I know it's becoming less politically correct to talk about it, but there was an element in Germany that wanted to control everyone and the world, and they started arresting people, and because the first people they started with weren't directly affecting the rest of the people, they thought, well, they must have done something. And I don't know how many times I've heard that, well, if that person must have done something or they wouldn't have arrested him, especially when it comes to the health of, well, they must have been doing something or they wouldn't have arrested him. And so they didn't pay attention, and then pretty soon they came from another group of people and arrested them and hauled them off to the ovens and the gas chambers and the prison camps, etc. But it wasn't affecting the general populace as much. And so they continued to ignore it and go on until finally one day they started coming for a pile of those people, but by that time it was too late because there was no one to help anymore. And so we don't want you to be like that. We want you to think for yourself, and we want you to make your own decisions. And I don't say everybody should do natural health. If they don't believe in it, then don't do it. If you feel that you're getting the benefit you want to get from what you're doing, then that's the thing you should do. But you might want to look at what the alternatives first are and the detriments of doing what you're doing, and see if you're willing to trade the detriments for what you think might be the benefits. I'm, bottom line, trying to teach you to critically think about your health and your welfare, not what I'm saying is so, but what you might think is so. We've overextended our time, but we're getting it all in 2 sessions, so I hope that I've been provocative enough that you might want to look into what's going on when you're offered the next prescription for an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety drug or some other medication. You might want to look into the background of it, and you might want to read through this book first, The Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America. Robert Whitaker. I think it will be eye-opening, and I think that if you're really interested, and read Dr. Bregan's book, Toxic Psychiatry, and Your Drug May Be Your Problem is another one of his. There's others he's put out also. But as of now, they haven't been able to shut him up. And so he keeps presenting a lot of material. And many years ago when I first started to study psychology, psychiatry, because at one time I was going to be a full-time psychologist, and I actually worked in the field of psychotherapy in my early years in the therapy field. I did a lot of psychotherapy and hypnotherapy. And I remember I ran across the writings of a psychiatrist by the name of Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-Z. And he wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. And it was quite eye-opening. And if you can go back and find that book, you might want to start there even and see what he has to say. And of course what he did say spread around to Great Britain and other places of the world. And there were a lot of people who wrote about it, but Szasz was the big eye-opener about the whole thing. And as I've gone over the years, I found that pretty much his ideas were on target, and I don't say people don't have problems, but I'm saying destroying the brain by using chemicals that shut down or manipulate the brain chemistry is not an answer. And I am convinced that the big unusual shootings we've had in this country, if you go back and look, I believe you'll find that every one of the shooters were on some of these drugs, and many had been on for a long time. And so I'm not wanting to get political, but I'm saying I think that the drugs are dangerous. I think they're dangerous to yourself and to sometimes other people around. And there are other answers that are actually effective, but are not made popular because they're not as profitable. So at this point, let's terminate this whole thing. It's a passion of mine because I've seen so many people, and when I was training I saw so many people, as this whole thing changed, that were damaged by the field. And so I would say, go to our website and see what some of the things are that we're doing, and bit by bit I'm adding other things. We're looking forward to a major overhaul of the website, so be tolerant of the fact it's been like it is for a while. We've added some things to it, but it needs a whole new format, and we're looking and putting something like that together. It takes time, and I spend a lot of time in live therapy with patients, as well as preparing these programs and writing other material and so forth. So it sometimes takes me a bit to get to certain things, and I have to take them as they are. The priority is there. So it was nice to be with you again, and from mindyourhealthcast.com, be healthy.